Most writers have heard they should use active voice instead of passive voice in their stories. However, knowing that you should do this and understanding why and how you should usually alter your passive voice are two different levels of understanding. So today I want to talk about passive voice, how to recognize and fix it in creative writing. You need to know the pros, cons, and effects of passive voice so you can make the best decisions for your piece when you are looking at your sentence structure and phrasing. I do want to note, today I'm going to talk about the very specific grammar type of passive voice, as well as a broader definition of passive phrasing that's going to include some things that aren't technically passive voice, but they have the same negative effects on your story and your sentences, and they can be fixed in the same way as passive voice. So we're going to talk about all of that. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. Let's start with defining passive voice and passive phrasing. According to grammar guides, passive voice is when the subject of the sentence is being acted upon instead of performing the action itself. And like many aspects of grammar, this is best understood through examples. So here are two passive sentences. The toilet was overflowing with water. The park had been decorated with streamers. Notice how in the first example, the toilet is not the one performing the overflowing action. That is the water. And in the second version, the park is not the subject doing the decorating. It is the subject being decorated upon. So that's why these two sentences are passive. When you're looking at passive voice, passive phrasing, you're looking for words like was or is, words like had been or to be. Those are clues that you have used passive phrasing. Now, like I said, we're going to expand our definition of passive voice to include some other situations for this video and in creative writing in general. Sometimes it's not that the subject is not performing the action, but it's that that subject is not following through all the way with the action, or you are telling instead of showing. Here are two examples of that type of passive phrasing. Jim started to run after Fluffy. Here, instead of performing the running action, Jim is only starting the action. He's not finishing it. Sarah felt sad. Here, the phrasing is passive because it is telling instead of showing. So this is more of you as the author thinking passively instead of actively describing how Sarah is feeling. Passive voice and phrasing can often be you as the author thinking a little bit passively or not really committing to your sentences, like you would if you were using active voice. Passive voice and phrasing is usually fairly simple to fix. All it means is changing a word here and there. So here are those same 4 sentences rewritten to be active instead of passive. Water overflowed from the toilet. Here, the water is the subject and it's performing the action of overflowing. Streamers decorated the park. Here, the streamers are performing the decorating action. Jim ran after Fluffy. Instead of just starting to run, Jim is actually running. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Instead of just telling the reader what Sarah felt, you're showing the reader and you're providing more information, because when someone is sad enough that their eyes are filling with tears, that's a different level of sad than someone who is just frowning or than someone who is sobbing. So it's providing more information with just a couple more words. Active voice, according to grammar guides, is when the subject of the sentence is performing the action, like they are in these sentences. So all you have to do is flip your sentence around to change it from passive to active. Also, notice the verbs of the sentences themselves. When you're using active voice, you're using more specific, detailed verbs that create a better mental picture for your reader. When you use passive voice, you're using verbs that aren't always so detailed. That transitions nicely to my next point. How passive voice slows your pace. Passive phrasing words like was, is, started, began, to be, had been are empty words. What I mean by that is when I say was, what comes to mind? Do you see a picture in your head? Likely you don't. That's because that word doesn't really mean anything concrete until it is placed in the context of a sentence. When you are writing creatively, you are trying to give a reader an experience. That means using the 5 senses, using specific details, and painting a mental picture for them. Empty words don't help you do that. So instead of using a word like was, you want to use a more specific active verb that is going to provide a specific detail. When I say ran, that provides so much more information than a verb like was. It tells me someone is moving, it tells me that they're moving quickly, and that they're spending a lot of energy. So much more information is packed into those specific verbs. So you want to use those more than your passive voice verbs. When you use passive voice empty verbs, you slow the pace of your story because it's going to take more words for your reader to get that mental picture. Similarly, when you filter your story too literally through your character's eyes, you're going to use extra words in the same way. When you have a first, second, or third person point of view, your reader knows that that scene is being filtered through a specific character's eyes. So you don't need to tell me that that character saw something. All you need to tell your reader is what that character saw. Here's an example. Sarah heard a loud bang. Or, Timmy watched his paper boat sink. Both of these sentences are being filtered too literally through the character's point of view. Instead, you could easily write bang or the paper boat sank. When you eliminate those unnecessary words of heard and saw, you pull the reader closer to that sensory experience. So instead of watching a character hear bang, the reader gets to hear bang themselves. At the same time, they know the character is experiencing that sensation. Don't allow passive voice to unintentionally slow the pace of your story in this way. So if you have a tendency to use passive voice, do a word search for those words. And when you're doing your final revision pass, look at changing some of them. Now, there might be a time where you want to intentionally slow down the pace of a scene. In that case, you might want to keep some of your passive phrasing. Usually, though, readers and authors want more active scenes, faster paced ones, so active voice works better. That's how passive voice slows the pace of your story. Next, I want to share how passive phrasing distances readers from characters and action. When you're using passive phrasing, like started to run or felt, you're actually distancing yourself as the writer and your reader from that character's experience and from what's happening in the story. When someone starts to perform an action, when you say they started to run, that implies two things. One, it implies that they didn't fully run, and two, that they did not complete that action. At some point, they were interrupted. That's not usually what you mean when you say someone started to run. Usually an author means they started to run and actually ran. But that's not how it reads, and it provides this extra word that you don't need. So instead of a character starting an action, just let them do it. People rarely start something and don't finish it in that context. So avoid using words like started and began. Often when an author uses this starting or began word, it's because they haven't fully committed to that choice of verb or to that action in the scene. It's kind of a subconscious tick that some authors have. So this is a habit you need to break if you have it. Commit to your scenes. Commit to that action. You can always go back and change it later, but you won't know what it fully looks like until you let the character perform it and see what happens. They also push readers farther away in the same way that the earlier passive voice examples do, was and to be, because they provide extra unnecessary words that are slowing your pace and making a reader work harder to create that mental picture. Now, passive phrasing, such as felt and feels, in terms of character emotions, have the opposite effect. When you tell a reader what a character felt instead of showing them, you're actually using too few words instead of too many, but it's still distancing the reader from that emotion. When I say I felt sad, that doesn't really convey much information, and it's not very real to someone else. What does sad feel like to your character? How does it physically manifest inside them? How does it affect their decision making? So earlier, when Sarah's eyes welled with tears, that didn't just tell me she was sad, it told me how sad and what sadness does to her body, how it feels for her. That is way more interesting to read, and it's actually going to speed up your pace and create a more vivid mental picture than if you just use the verb felt. Again, this is a passive way of thinking, and it's a way for the author to distance themselves from that emotion. Sometimes your character is going through an intense scene or an intense emotion that you yourself don't want to feel, and you'll use words like the character felt instead of really seeping into that emotion and showing the reader what it's like for that character to experience that emotion. You have to be a little vulnerable when you're writing those types of scenes and sentences. Also, when you use felt, you are cheating yourself out of a bit of character development. How a character experiences emotion and how they react to that feeling say a lot about who they are. So when you show that experience instead of just telling a reader they felt something, you're actually developing your character and deepening them, which we always want to do. So those are some ways using passive voice distances you as the author and your reader from your story. I want to leave you with why an editor recommends avoiding passive voice most of the time. Today's readers like stories that move and get to the point. Passive voice, for the most part, is the opposite of this. That's why authors are told to use active voice instead of passive voice. But like most of my other videos, I'm not going to tell you to never do something because passive voice does have its place. Sometimes if you've written a very active scene, concluding it with a single, straightforward, passive voice sentence can be more impactful than trying to rewrite that sentence in an active way. For example, if you just wrote a scene where a little girl wandered out in a zombie apocalypse and their parents are trying to save her before she gets bit by a zombie, and you write that whole scene where they get her away from the zombie, ending that scene with a sentence like Caroline was bitten can be way more impactful than if you try and describe the bite. All your reader really needs is that passive sentence and the gravity it carries with it. So passive voice isn't all bad. It should just be used sparingly and intentionally. My rule of thumb when I am looking at passive voice in my own writing and the writing of my clients is to look at the effort and effects of changing it. So if I have a sentence that was written with passive voice and it's super easy to switch it into active voice, for example, was running is really easy to switch to ran, I'm going to switch that no-brainer most of the time. If I have a sentence that's a little bit more complicated to change, but when I switch from passive to active voice, it becomes more specific and detailed, it reveals something more about the character, or in some way adds new and more information to the story, I'm probably going to change that from passive to active voice. But if I have a passively phrased sentence that becomes really convoluted and difficult to understand when I change it to active voice, or is going to take a lot of rethinking as well as rewriting, I might just leave that one and say, hey, it's fine to have a passive voice sentence every once in a while. So look at the effort and effects of changing your passive voice before you try and change every passive sentence in your entire piece. Again, passive voice should be avoided, not eradicated. When you're looking at passive voice, it should be in the later stages of revision. Don't think about this when you're drafting. The more you write, the better you will get at drafting without passive voice. But it's still going to slip in there. And after you have made the scene as good as you can, and it's the right action, the right character development, the scene itself is what you need it to be, that's when you're going to go back and look at your sentence structure to make sure it is the best construction to convey the details of that scene. That's when you're going to stop and look at your passive voice. Don't worry about it any earlier than that. What are your passive phrasing tendencies? For me, when I write, I tend to use passive phrasing when I'm setting up the setting for a scene. So I pay special attention to that when I'm doing my final revision passes. What about you? Share your passive phrasing tendencies in the comments below. And for more videos on structuring sentences, structuring stories, and other aspects of writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers. Because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. You can find out more about me by going to www.ignitedinkwriting.com. There you will also find a synonym voice worksheet, which will help you use phrasing and word choice to create your character and authorial voices. And now it's your turn to change from passive to active voice and phrasing, to tighten your prose, to speed up your pace, to pull your readers in closer to your story, and to ignite your ink.